Since its foundation in 1913, Waldzug has been committed to building a sustainable future through the manufacturing of long-lasting kitchen and textile care appliances and responsible carbon-neutral production. It means the Swiss firm is well placed to tackle the topic of timelessness in design. And that's exactly what it will do across 3 special episodes of Monocle on Design. Recorded at Milan Design Week, the final episode airs on Wednesday, 13th of June. We'll hear from designers including Jay Oscarby, Simone Farasin and Tosi Oshinowo.
Where you're contributing towards the urban environment, it's really, really important to create architecture that stands out but also recedes gently. It has to have a level of balance.
So tune in for some essential discussion on ensuring quality and longevity are imbued in our homes and workplace with Waldzug.
This is Monocle on Design, a show where we discuss everything from architecture and craft to furniture and fashion. I'm Nick Manise. On today's program, David Rockwell, the architect and designer, reflects on 40 years of bringing drama into any space. We meet emerging designers turning seafood waste and shells into glassware and fashion, plus product and furniture designer Tom Fereday on how the Australian design industry has blossomed. All that coming up on Monocle on Design. We start today's program with the US architect and designer David Rockwell, a master at cultivating drama within any environment. Alongside founding the architecture and design firm Rockwell Group, specialising in hospitality, culture, healthcare and education, David's strand of theatre production designs have continued throughout his career and show a penchant for performance. Previous projects include backdrops for musicals, including She Loves Me, for which he won a Tony Award in 2016, and the likes of the W Hotel in New York, which he has recently returned to update after first designing it some 20 years ago. At the most recent Salone del Mobile, David joined us at our pop-up studio to reflect on 4 decades of practice and tell us what it's taught him.
My job is to find the intersections of other ideas. And I think as you grow as a studio, this is our 40th anniversary, you start to really learn how to look at things, and you might be looking at an installation. What you really want to know is how the hardware was made or how the streetscape works. So there's a couple of principles to our studio. One is we're very research-based. So to be spontaneous, you have to do a lot of research to at least have some information and ideas at your fingertips. And it's one of the things I always tell young designers who start working is start by looking around and trying to understand, be curious. Curiosity, I think, is the key to a design career. And to do that, you have to be looking outward. Another guiding principle of Rockwell Group is we like to look at design as the intersection of other pieces. So while my career has been driven by hospitality, we are now looking at how hospitality interacts with universities for Johns Hopkins, airports, hospitals. That sense of the building kind of greeting you and wrapping its arms around you is not a project type that only applies to restaurants or hotels. The third principle is we don't really have a house style. We try and emerge that style out of 1 or 2 specifics. Dive deep and you think about what are the kind of unusual ways to approach something. That can turn into gimmicky very easily. I think that what you want to try and do is find something that grows out of the program, something that feels like it illuminates what's happening in there. In restaurants, of course, it's the food, but I also do theater sets, which was kind of a hobby for 10 or 15 years, but now has turned into one of the greatest gifts of my life. In that case, you have the script. You do have a template. Curiosity and research are connected.
They do seem like they all kind of feed into each other. I want to ask about those intersections and how that does feed off curiosity, because the pairing of unexpected things often, I think, leads to completely unexpected and original outcomes. It does feel like all these principles are touching and feeding into each other, which again would mean you don't necessarily have a house style. Is that how these all sort of play? Is it like a triangle?
It is true, and one example, we're working on a project that for me is kind of extraordinary, and that is we're doing a redo of a hotel for W that we did 20 years ago. So we did the first W before it was a brand, and in that case we had to kind of emerge a point of view out of that on 49th Street. And there were many ideas we had about the original W that had to do with embracing quirkiness, being somewhat local, but also being global. The Union Square W opened up in 2000, and so when we had a chance to redo it, it was like such a breath of fresh air because I felt like I had 20 years rehearsal to do it. I think we live in this world where everyone thinks things happen automatically and Interestingly, phones, Instagram, I think things that take longer to happen are the more profound ones. So we've had a 20-year runway to take this hotel and develop all new points of view. For instance, W's always been about kind of quirky art installations. We've taken that into things you want to touch, so lots and lots of textures. Hospitality and touching are an interesting, unusual intersection.
I want to ask what it's like to come back to your own work 20 years later. Were there things that you were proud of? Were there things that you were like, oh, maybe this didn't stand up the way that I would have liked it to? What's that experience like for you as a person, as well as a designer?
I think what you do is you find ideas you were interested in that maybe weren't fully realized, or just I've deepened my understanding of Union Square, which is the park that the hotel's on, and noticed many more nuances and layers and details. And I think we've gotten more skillful at doing that. There's a few things you look at and wince and go, was that really what I wanted to do? But we do have these long-term relationships. Nobu we've been working with for 30 years. So I think as an architect, if you look at what you're doing not as just a transaction, but as a partnership and a relationship, it's a much more, I find, enriching and fulfilling project.
It's quite fascinating as well to hear you talk about these ongoing relationships. Maybe a lot of the time people would think an architect, you finish the project, that's it, you're done, you hand it over. But you're saying you have these ongoing discussions, ongoing relationships with the people that you work with. How critical is that to continuing to deliver good, I'm going to call architecture a product, but good product?
For me, the key to delivering good product is not believing your press necessarily, being willing to take risks, and not being defined in a box. And I think that's probably the most unique thing about Rockwell Group is that the world creates boxes around the work that you do. And I think we've transformed that breaking into theater, breaking into other kinds of work requires fearlessness about stepping into new territory. As I said, we do research, so we're not stepping into it blindly and believe just by eminent domain the ideas are going to just come to us. But I think not being trapped in a box is critical, and I think being willing to take risks is critical.
You've got this 40 years of experience as a studio. Can I ask, what would the ideal next 40 look like? What's your hope for Rockwell Group, I guess, going forward?
I do truly believe the best work we've done over 40 years is the work we're doing right now. I think that may be because we get better opportunities. We get the ability to convince clients to take some risks. What the next 10 or 15 years are going to be driven by is projects we haven't had a chance to be involved with that I'm interested in. We're doing 1 or 2 parks. I'm very interested in performing art spaces, and we do theaters. So I think it's just going to be continuing to find great partnerships, great ideas.
One of the big challenges, a lot of practitioners have is trying to convince their client to do the right thing. And it's fascinating that you say that there. You've now got the body of work behind you that allows maybe clients to listen a bit better. What was that like getting started? How did you start to convince people that they needed to trust you and work? I guess I'm asking on behalf of all the architects and landscape architects and interior designers out there.
There's a couple of things. One is every project I did from day one felt like life and death, that the idea of getting it right was a driving force. My first project, I borrowed money from a friend of mine to finish the project because it was so unthinkable that parts of it wouldn't be finished. I think you have to be driven and obsessed. I think to make things, it has to be a passion. You have to believe that's the only thing you can do because it requires that kind of commitment. And then the other thing is, there's such a temptation to model your work on other people's work. I think spending some time figuring out what are your eccentric edges, what are your passions that seem outside of the norm, and building on those. So the idea of narrative, having a story, from first day of architecture school, I was writing stories about buildings I was doing, even though the professor said, we don't need the story, it's just a formal figure ground study. And I said, well, for me, having some backstory will help me do that. When I give talks to students and they're looking for ways to succeed, I always point to it's not following someone else, it's finding your own interest.
I love that. Maybe this is a perfect way to round that out. What advice would you have given to David 40 years ago as he set out on this? Is there a silver bullet to a successful practice in studio?
Someone gave me really great advice early on, which was they gave me a tape measure and a camera and said, as you start to go around and look at things, start to figure out how they're built. Start to look at dimensions, start to understand your body in relation to spaces. And it turns out to be really good advice, because I find many young designers develop great graphic skills, great ability to 3D model, but not enough kind of look at how do things start with a human being. How do you develop spaces that are based on human-centric ideas?
Sage advice from David Rockwell there. We'll be back right after this.
The Foreign Desk is Monocle Radio's weekly world affairs programme. We tackle the biggest global news stories as well as those too often left untold.
I've been out on the streets of Lagos. People are unable to withdraw their cash. Fights have broken out in banking halls.
As well as the occasional retelling of events from days long past.
The gates opened and in came this horse, absolutely huge, made of wood. People were asking, what's it for? Is it some kind of icon?
Our expert guests offer in-depth analysis and first-hand experience.
There were a lot of diplomatic efforts by NATO and NATO allies. We really made big efforts to convince Russia not to invade.
The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller, is available every Saturday from midday London time, right here on Monocle Radio.
Many makers today look to incorporate sustainability into their practice, and some creatives have turned to material technology as one method to reduce their impact on the environment. Monocle's Hannah Pham was intrigued by designers in the UK who are exploring the potential uses of waste generated by the seafood and fishing industries. She met with a few of these material innovators and makers and sent us this report.
The catching and processing of fish in the UK creates an enormous amount of waste. Less than half of the fish and shellfish caught ends up on our plates. The 60-odd% leftover becomes waste. Innovative designers across the UK are utilising the sheer amount of bones, shells and skin at their disposal. Ria Thomas, founder of Sea Sprout, saw an opportunity to transform prawn shells into fertilising seed trays.
I come from a coastal town back in India, from Mangalore, and we're already facing the consequences of climate change through land laws. Growing up in a coastal environment, I grew up eating a lot of seafood. When I started looking at shrimp waste in the UK, I realized that most of it comes from countries like Vietnam, India, and they're the ones having to deal with all of this waste. That's kind of where I had to go back to, mapping where's the shrimp coming from. Nelo is one of the largest seafood exporters, and they're having to deal with all of that waste.
By following the circular economy framework, Thomas's innovations ensures that at no point in the process is any waste created. Vital to her work is chitosan, a sugar derived from the outer skeleton of shellfish.
I've literally taken the prawn shells, powdered them down, dried them out, added natural binders like seaweed, and then made it into the material, then kind of processed it into the product, the final trays. But in that process, I realized there's still 60% of the material that's being discarded. So I didn't want to be wasting any material with whatever I created. Whereas with chitosan, you do get very high application products, it can be used in the biomedical space for packaging. With Sea Sprout, we're trying to make sure there's no waste at any point, which is why even with chitosan, we kind of looked at how do we optimize that and utilize the entire shrimp. The product is getting made into these plant pots that can be put into the soil. So when it's being put in the soil, you're not only reducing the amount of plastic that's being used, but also that breaks down in like 6 months' time. So it's acting as like plant fertilizer.
Following her win in regenerative design from the Foundation Futures Awards, more and more shrimp farmers have been reaching out to collaborate.
At the very core and working with like community, we've tried to make sure everything's as sustainable as possible in the long term. They do kind of see value in it because there's like a lot of waste. I've been putting in a lot of like research into what are the other applications. So maybe it's like interiors and construction material. Maybe it's even like into fashion, because even fashion's a very polluting industry.
Cambridge-based Aesop Taylor is the founder of Skinned Potential, a clothing brand that specializes in fish leather.
A lot of fish are sold with the skin off, like smoked salmon. That's when a lot of the skins go to waste. Some companies are able to turn the skins into low-value products, like pet food or biofuel. And then some companies don't have the means to utilize the skins, so they often go to the bin, and they can pollute waterways, or sometimes they get thrown back into the ocean. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of utilising the byproducts of fish. Fish leather as a whole is a very old concept. Many indigenous groups have used fish leather for centuries as part of their cultural heritage. It's just in fashion that it is a new thing, because fashion is trying to find sustainable solutions and is now turning to fish leather as another option. A lot of people jump to conclusions about fish leather because of the fact that they've never experienced it before, which is hard for people bringing fish leather into fashion. The main ones being that fish leather smells of fish, which is false, and that fish leather is weak, which is also false, because fish leather is actually up to 9 times stronger than cow leather, tensile strength-wise, so per thickness, it's actually stronger.
Although fish leather has been around for ages, at times, working with salmon skin comes with its challenges and need for more experimentation.
It's not easy, that's for sure. The hardship mainly has been perfecting a tanning process, because tanning is a process that you use for cow leather and other leathers as well, which basically involves using tannins which come from plants. Even tea has a lot of tannins in, and wine. And the tannins change the structure of the skin so that it's no longer skin but a leather. The tannins actually change the textile, which is when it becomes something which lasts a long time as opposed to a skin which would disintegrate. It's quite hard to find precise information, so a lot of it has been my own experimentation to try and figure things out. And of course the tanning is so important, because if it's not tanned properly, then you're not going to get rid of the fish smell, which is a vital thing for it to work in fashion. Dyeing the skins as well can be tricky. Dyeing it even across the whole skin can be hard, because the skin has a natural colour gradient going light to dark. Again, there is more experimentation needed for what kind of texture of leather you're going for and then how to achieve it. There's so much potential for the leather.
Meanwhile, other designers have turned to different bits of seafood waste, like shells. Oxford-based glassmaker Lulu Harrison discovered the invasive species of quagga mussels in the Thames.
The quagga mussels, they're actually a huge problem for water companies all over the country, because they get stuck inside water pipes and they have to get removed on a mass scale, and that mass material of shell just ends up in landfill. I got in touch with Thames Water and the head of ecology there, and was interested in collecting some of these shells, seeing if they could be used in a glass batch. So I went over and got the shell powder chemically analysed, and it came back as being 99.3% pure calcium carbonate. This was a material that was once used in glass making, and it acts as one of the major components to help strengthen the glass.
Prior to her project, Thames Glass, Harrison worked with the coastal community in Cornwall to come up with ways to integrate their byproducts into her glassmaking.
I did a project working with fishermen down in Newlyn, looking at exploring ways of reviving the threatened industries in the fishing industry and local economies through new material processes. I started to experiment with waste shells, which I got from various processing plants.
For Harrison, her work is about changing what luxury means in glassware and pushing for that definition to include sustainability.
With a lot of sort of luxury glassware, there's quite a big environmental cost. Typically, a lot of the materials that are used in glass making, they do have to be transported from all across the world because they do use very specific, very high-grade materials, and that does create that kind of luxury feel. There's huge transport emissions. As well as that, you've obviously got it's a massively energy-intensive industry. The batches have to be melted at extremely high temperature. There's a lot of things within the glass industry that are very unsustainable, but is an amazing craft and one that has been handed down through generations. What's interesting is just kind of looking at that idea of how we can kind of localize it and working with local materials and maybe materials that are abundant. For the project I'm working on at the moment, I'm kind of looking at working with materials which are seasonal, but they're also waste materials. So that idea of kind of working with what we have.
The waste generated from the seafood industry is not going anywhere anytime soon. What is shifting is how more and more designers are incorporating long-neglected byproducts as critical components of their products. So, maybe in the near future, we'll be able to not only find seafood at the fishmonger, but in our clothes, glassware, and gardening accessories. For Monocle in London, this is Hannah Pham.
What kind of city do you want to live in? Every week on The Urbanist, we delve into the biggest questions about urban living and meet the people championing change in our cities. From starchitects to designosauruses, protected views to landfills, river walks and sidewalks, wayfinding and cycle highways. The city is alive and kicking, so how can we make them better places to live in?
The other great city creation, of course, is sex. Young people go to cities to have a good time and to enjoy themselves and to meet their life partners and maybe a few other people on the way.
Join me, Andrew Tuck, every Thursday at 2000 hours London time for a brand new episode. Or subscribe to the podcast and listen as you go. The Urbanist, the show that knows its good mares from its planning nightmares.
Australian-born Tom Fereday grew up in London, where he studied sculpture and graphic design before moving to Sydney to complete a degree in industrial design. He decided to stay in the sunny Australian city and established his namesake studio in Sydney in 2012. Today, clients across Australia and Europe are drawn to his use of natural materials and impressive body of work, which includes collaborations with the likes of Louis Vuitton, Alessi and Stella Works. He joined me in the studios at Midori House to reflect on how the Australian design industry continues to flourish. I began by asking Tom why, despite so many Australian creatives swapping continents, he continues to work from Sydney.
The beginning of my career, I worked even in London with Mark Newson for a short period of time. I travelled and worked in Europe a little bit. But when I began the decision of being my sole practice, I tried to think about where would be the most exciting place to begin that. And I chose to do it in Sydney because there felt like there's huge change happening there. The Australian design scene 10 years ago is extremely different to what it is now. There's a kind of a movement and an energy about that where there was an excitement about being an independent designer, felt it could be real and it could work. And so it wasn't a strategic maneuver. It was a feeling of support with amazing makers and craftsmen I've worked with over the years. And then that fostering of support in the Australian industry where really my entire adult life I'd kind of been around. But I think the major mover was just seeing there's real change happening in the design scene in Australia that is quite new. It's exciting. And I think that's what kind of drew me to go, I'd love to be building upon this and not just running away from it and going to where the major epicenter of design is.
What's that change that's happening? Is there an increased public awareness or an entrepreneurialism? What's the shift?
There's always been a support for Australian design locally. But I think that shift down into areas of design, such as furniture and product, really started to grow. So when I was in the early career, even as a student, it was really about Scandinavian or Italian design. And I think that really translates into how people purchased or developed furniture. As those years went on, this incredible focus first proving that the quality can come from Australian-made products, and that proving that we could make stuff on a par to the quality of Italian-made or German-made, whatever the region. And then the second stage was proving that we can design on the quality of international credible. And so I would say pioneering designers, creatives who have stuck in Australia and forged that has built the identity now that's growing of what is Australian design. And that's someone myself who is very much, in terms of heritage, half English, half Australian.
Is there something to be said as well about maybe not having the weight of history that some of the, I guess, countries or design communities in Europe have?
Definitely, yeah. There is a sense of entrepreneurialism in Australia that I can see friends who are young architect firms or designers who traditionally may have worked through a career for a long period of time before emerging as an independent designer. In Australia, there feels like this energy, a quiet confidence to go and have a go and do it. And I think that's something about the culture of Australia as well that's embodied in that.
I'm curious how this translates to your own work. You've set up your own studio, you've been running it for a number of years. Are there any driving principles or driving ethos that guides your work?
Yeah, so going back to when I was looking at being an artist, constraints were really important for me. So I needed to have a drive and a long-term vision about every product I work on that's on a footpath or a trajectory. And fairly early on, it came really perhaps obvious principles of honest design. So making something where there's nothing to hide. When I first began my studio, we'd photograph by lifting up a chair and we'd show every angle of the piece to say, we'd hope that this is considered and beautiful from every angle, and that we were saying there's nothing to hide in where or how it was made as well. A kind of an integrity to the work paired with a kind of celebration of natural materials. So every piece I work on, we try to quietly celebrate the material and not to take away from it, but complement that material in the forms and the pieces that we develop.
I mean, is there a recent example that we can talk of or walk through? We launched the Mesa collection in Milan Design Week, and that was a solid travertine collection built on originally a timber collection that we already produced. And the pieces are designed for a lifetime or more. They're works that I can feel really proud and confident that someone could own that for generations. And so there's a element there where we're trying to make works that will be elegant, but also be elegant as they get older and they get used. And there's sort of an importance there that I've built into every piece that I work on. And that's produced with local makers in Australia?
For the pieces that we make in Australia, it's all made in Australia. For Italy, we made it just 3 hours from our exhibition in Milan.
That comes back to that honesty, having that, I guess the connection with the materials, connection with the makers, kind of wherever you are in the world.
I think a localization of how you make pieces is just natural, and it just felt right not to be sending pieces halfway around the world.
I think so, and I think that also kind of lends itself to, I think there's a shift happening at these design weeks where there's a heightened awareness of, you might have a low impact installation, but really the impact of bringing things in from all over the world is massive.
Yeah, Milan for me is a kind of a staging to, reflect upon my work amongst the international design community. And it's really important to be involved. But the realities of producing work is I'm always looking at the long-term outcome of that piece I might present. So I never make a work just for that specific exhibition. That's the beginning of the journey of that piece. And so those works will stay in Europe, and then they will go into homes in a retailer in Europe. So there's a kind of try not to just do things for the sake of it.
You talked at the very start of this, and maybe this is a nice way to finish, you talked about wanting constraints, liking constraints with industrial design. Were there any new constraints added to this new product that maybe you hadn't worked with for a while, it sounds like?
Yeah, I think with the audio industry, every time you see a speaker, all of the physical components of a speaker are on display. We wanted to create a truly sculptural speaker that's mono-material. So every element you see is sand-cast aluminium. And there were a lot of constraints to make that compatible in an audio quality perspective. And so really coming through collaboration we're trying to achieve a sculptural approach to a technical product. And in the home, I think that's a really interesting touch point, is to have an audio equipment piece, but it actually could be seen as almost a sculpture or a side table in a home.
Tom Fereday there, and that's all for today's show. For more design stories, listen to our 5-minute midweek bonus show, Monocle on Design Extra, which airs on Thursdays. And if you enjoy print, then do pick up a copy of Monocle magazine as well. It's on all good newsstands now. Today's episode was produced and edited by Maylee Evans. I'm Nick Manise, and you can reach me on nm@monocle.com. Thanks for listening.